it's Stephen Bedard, and I want to talk to you about the feeding of the 5,000. And before I share my thoughts, I want to read the passage to you because it's important that this be grounded in the Word. So I'm going to be reading from Luke's version of it, which is found in Luke 9, verses 10 to 17. On the return, the apostles told Jesus all they had done. He took them with him and withdrew privately to a city called Bethsaida. When the crowds found out about it, they followed him, and he welcomed them, and spoke to them about the kingdom of God, and healed those who needed to be cured. The day was drawing to a close, and the 12 came to him and said, "Send the crowd away, so that they may go into the surrounding villages and countryside to lodge and get provisions, for they are here in a deserted place." But he said to them, "You give them something to eat." They said, "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, unless we are to go and buy food for all these people." For there were about 5,000 men. And he said to his disciples, "Make them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so, and made them all sit down. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and blessed and broke them, and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. What was left over was gathered up, 12 baskets of broken pieces. Now, how do we know when someone really means something? Of course, we would think that if someone just says something once, that they really mean it. But have you ever noticed when someone seems to repeat themselves? They will say the same thing a couple of times, maybe in a few different ways, but they will say the same thing. That repetition tells us that this person really means what they're saying. This is something that is really important. This is not just a side issue. And I bring this up because the feeding of the 5,000 is actually the only miracle that is found in all 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of them share the feeding of the 5,000. So I'm thinking that this is an important story. This is something that really says something that we need to take some principles from and apply it to our lives. So I want to talk to you a little bit about it. But before we dive into it, we really need a little bit of context of what is going on, because it really helps to inform us of what this miracle story is all about. So immediately before this passage, we have Jesus sending out the 12 disciples. And this was an important moment for them because they were going out not as observers to what Jesus was doing, but they were going out by themselves as active participants. And they're going out, and we're told that they were performing miracles and doing great deeds. And it just was an incredible thing. And so this story takes place just as the apostles come back. They come back to Jesus, and that's where these events take place. And then immediately after this is when Jesus asks who people say that he is, and Peter responds and gives the correct answer of who Jesus is, that his identity has been made clear. So that is an important context for us as we look at the feeding of the 5,000. And I see in this story 3 lessons for us as Christians today. 3 principles that we find in this passage that are directly applicable to our experience today. So the first thing is that these disciples, they doubted their ability to do this. It just did not seem doable to them. That they looked at how many people were needed to be fed, and they couldn't do it. How are they possibly going to feed so many people? But think back to what had just happened. These same disciples had just been out on a preaching tour, performing miracles, doing all kinds of great things. You would think that they would have been on a spiritual high, confident. Perhaps you would think that they would even be overconfident in their own power and ability to perform miracles, and yet they come back. They see that there's a need, and they're like, well, we can't do anything about this. And the principle here for us is that the successes of yesterday are not enough for today. We might have a great experience 2 weeks ago, 2 years ago, 2 decades ago. We can't live on that today. We need faith for today. It's great that God answered those prayers. It's great that God used us in some amazing way years back. But what about today? We need faith for today. So that's the first principle that I want to share with you. So the second thing I want to talk about here is that Jesus expected the disciples to do the feeding. So what happens? We have these 5,000 men, and the assumption is that there's more than just men there. So there's a huge crowd that is around, and it is obvious that there's a need that is there. And Jesus doesn't just step up and say, hey, let me take this one. This is good. I'll feed them. You guys can just watch. This will be no problem. That's not what happens. Jesus actually looks at them after they tell Jesus and suggest to Jesus that he should send them away. Jesus says, you feed them. You meet the need. And the principle here is that we are not supposed to just sit around, not even just praying, as important as prayer is, but we need to see the needs that are around us and do something about it. You never know. You actually might be a part of the way that God is going to answer those prayers. So we can't just look around and say, oh yeah, there's a lot of difficulty going on there. I guess I'm just going to pray about it, and I'm going to hold it close to my heart, and I'm just going to trust that God will do something. But God usually uses people. God doesn't usually make food magically appear. Of course, in this case, Jesus does make the food multiply. But most often today, it is about us seeing the need and meeting the need. Now, you might notice in this video, just beside my left shoulder there is a scale on the floor by my bookcase. That's not because I'm really worried about my weight, although I am trying to lose weight. That scale is actually for weighing food, because we, in our church, we are a downtown church. There's a lot of poor around us. And we are collecting food for the food bank, and we weigh that food because it helps us to set a goal to collect a certain amount, because we see that there is a need and we're trying to respond to that. So Jesus asks us to look at the needs around us and to see what we can do to do something about it. And that actually brings us to the third principle that is here. The disciples, they see the great amount of people. They're aware that they don't have enough to feed them. In fact, it says that there is only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, normally, we're not given that kind of detail. And so the fact that we are told that there is 5 loaves and 2 fish is meant to focus us on the limited resources that are available. So the disciples are aware of that. And they're thinking, because they have a lack of resources, they're not able to feed them. And yet, Jesus was able to take those 5 loaves and those 2 fish and to multiply them and to feed those people and to have food left over. And this is our final principle that I want to bring to your attention, that limited resources plus Jesus equals more than enough. I've always been a pastor of a small church. I've never pastored at a church more than 150 people. And I am very aware of what it is to have limited resources. So we can always use that excuse. We don't have enough. We can't make a difference. We don't have enough money. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough skills, whatever the lack is that we identify. But a lack of resources plus Jesus equals more than enough. And that's what we need to remember. That's what the disciples learned here, that Jesus can take what we have, as limited as that might be, and use it to meet the need. And so that can't stop us from trying to do something just because we're aware of how little we have. It's easy for us when we look at the story of the feeding of the 5,000 to criticize the disciples, to look at them and say, oh, what's the matter with them? Why didn't they have enough faith? I mean, this is Jesus. They should have just jumped right in there and just been totally full of faith, believing that something amazing was going to happen. But how would we have reacted if we were there? If we had saw 5,000 people and Jesus looked at us and said, you feed them, how would we react? We probably would react the same way as the disciples. So we need to cut them some slack. But from their experience, we can learn some important lessons. We can learn that the successes of yesterday are not enough for today. We need faith for each and every day. Secondly, we need to see the needs that are around us and attempt to meet them as well as we can. We can't just ignore the needs. We can't just pray about them, although we need to pray, but we need to seek to meet those needs. And finally, limited resources plus Jesus equals more than enough. And that are 3 lessons from the feeding of the 5,000. So I hope you found that helpful. And please visit me at my website at stephenjbedard.com and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much, and God bless.